Tonight, we explore a secret buried not in books, but in bone. A mystery whispered through centuries of silence, hidden beneath the marble floors of the Vatican itself. They say the church keeps many relics, but among the chalices and shrouds, there are rumours of something far older. Skeletons so large they could not belong to men, locked in crates beneath the city of God. Bones too long, skulls too wide, and a truth too heavy for the light. Not every treasure in the Vatican was meant to inspire faith. Some were meant to contain it. Deep below St. Peter's Basilica, where tourists never walk and even priests need permission to breathe, there are sealed vaults that hold what history could not explain. Old letters speak of bones catalogued without names, crates marked with stars and a strange symbol, an open eye inside a circle of laurel. A few witnesses claim to have seen them moved at night by men wearing gloves, escorted by silence. Their reports were denied, their records erased. Yet the rumours persist, echoing through the halls of history, like the sound of a locked door waiting to open. Could it be true? Did the Vatican uncover the remains of a race forgotten by time, beings so tall that their very existence would rewrite creation itself? Or were the bones symbols, relics of something greater, proof that the world once held lives larger than ours in every sense? If such giants were ever real, their discovery would not just challenge science, it would fracture belief, because to admit there were elder beings before man is to question who we really are and where our story began. Letters from old monks speak of anomalous remains. Jesuit field notes describe bones of a race that walked over us like bridges. Even within the Vatican's secret index, there are missing entries, blank spaces where catalogue numbers should be. Some say those empty lines are not mistakes, but markers of what was deliberately buried. The evidence was never destroyed. It was hidden, sealed beneath cathedrals that now stand like tombstones for truths too large to confess. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because tonight we're not just asking whether the Vatican found giant skeletons, we're asking why they hid them. What were they protecting? A myth? A mistake? Or the memory of a world that once stood taller than the one we were taught to believe in? History is written by the victors, but silence is written by the fearful. And somewhere in that silence, beneath layers of stone and centuries of faith, lies an answer carved in bone, not lost, just waiting. Because sometimes the real relics of power are not made of gold, but of memory. And if those bones still rest beneath the Vatican, then the truth may be taller than we ever imagined. They say the Vatican keeps many secrets, but few are as strange as what might lie beneath its marble floors. Not books, not relics, not ancient scrolls, but bones. Not the delicate remains of saints or popes, but something far larger. Bones too long, too heavy, too impossible to belong to any ordinary human. In whispered circles, they call it the bone behind the door. The story begins deep below Vatican City, where tourists never walk and even priests rarely go. Down past the catacombs, below the crypts of popes, there are corridors that stretch into silence. They say the air there feels thicker, like the weight of centuries pressing down. Guards who patrol those tunnels talk about rooms sealed with iron locks, marked with strange symbols that do not appear anywhere else in the Vatican. When asked what lies beyond them, they go quiet. Some smile nervously and say nothing. Others cross themselves. It is said that in the year 1537, a small excavation beneath St. Peter's Basilica uncovered something that should not have existed. Workers reported striking a chamber made of black stone, perfectly smooth, unlike anything found in Rome. Inside it, they found bones, enormous bones, a skull the size of a barrel, a jaw wide enough to hold a man's fist. The story was quickly buried, the chamber sealed again, and those who spoke of it were transferred or silenced. The church's official statement said the discovery was misinterpreted animal remains, but rumours persisted, carried through letters and whispered confessions. Some even claimed the Pope at the time ordered the bones moved to a private vault for further study. That vault was never opened again. Every few decades, the story returns. A worker disappears. A Vatican archivist leaves a mysterious note. A shipment of stone crates arrives at night and vanishes by morning. In the 19th century, a traveller claimed he saw one of the crates unloaded near the old archives. He said it was marked with an unfamiliar seal, a circle of stars around an open eye. The same symbol later found carved into an altar beneath St. John Lateran. Historians dismiss it all as myth, but myths have roots, and roots grow in truth. The question is not whether the bones exist, but why they would be hidden. Some believe the giants were the first people, a race older than Adam, erased when the world was remade. Others think they were proof of an age before the church, when gods walked among men. If such remains were ever proven real, it would rewrite everything: creation, faith, history itself. So maybe the secret was never about monsters, maybe it was about memory. About what humanity once was, and what it was made to forget. The Vatican's silence is not denial, it is protection. Because if one day that door ever opens, and the world sees what sleeps behind it, the bones might not just tell the story of giants, they might tell the story of us. He was 90 when he finally spoke, a man who had spent most of his life in the quiet corridors of the Vatican archives. His name was Matteo Rossi, a clerk, a man whose job was to move papers, seal boxes, and write names no one would ever read. For decades, he said nothing. But in the winter of 2006, in a small apartment overlooking the Tiber, he began to tell a story that few believed and fewer dared to repeat. He said there were nights when the archives did not sleep, when lights burned long after the priests had gone, and when the silence of the stone halls was broken by the sound of wheels and whispers. Crates, he said, always the same kind. Heavy, ancient, marked with symbols that did not belong to any church record. Stars arranged in a circle, and in the centre, an eye surrounded by laurel leaves. He called it the Eye of Remembrance, though he said no one ever used that name aloud. Matteo claimed the crates were handled with more care than any holy relic. No labels, no paperwork. Just a single word painted in red on the side of each box. Anomalum. Strange. Unfit. Out of place. The men who moved them wore gloves, thick white ones that never left a trace of dust. Matteo had one. He kept it, hidden in a small tin box, until the day he died. It was the only proof he ever had that his story was true. He said the crates came from the lowest vaults, the ones without catalogue numbers, the ones that did not exist on any list. Sometimes a bishop or a man in plain robes would oversee the transfer. They would sign no papers, speak no words, and disappear before dawn. One night, Matteo asked a question he should not have. He wanted to know what was inside. A guard told him quietly, almost kindly, that some things were not meant to be unboxed, that what was buried beneath St. Peter's was not history, but warning. Years later, after retirement, Matteo searched the public records for any mention of those shipments. There was nothing. The dates he remembered were blank. The archive logs skipped entire nights. When he returned to the Vatican as a visitor, the door to his old corridor had been sealed with new stone. No plaque, no entry, no trace. Before his death, he left a small notebook to his nephew. Inside it was a single sketch, a crate, the Eye of Remembrance, and what looked like a human skull drawn to scale beside a normal one. The larger was 3 times the size. Beneath it he had written one line: "They were not all saints. The glove still exists somewhere, kept as an oddity by collectors who never knew where it came from. But those who hold it say the same thing. It smells faintly of earth, as if it had once touched something ancient, something that was never meant to be moved. The Vatican has always measured everything. The height of altars, the age of relics, the length of scrolls. even the width of the nails said to have held the cross. Every discovery is recorded, logged, and filed with mathematical precision, except for one kind, the kind they never measure, the kind that does not fit. Inside the archives, every artifact has a record, a form written in careful Latin, describing its shape, material, and dimensions. But some records are different. Pages with blank spaces where the numbers should be, boxes marked with code words instead of measurements, objects that have no scale. It is not an accident, it is silence, written on purpose. A silence of measures. Historians say that when something cannot be classified, it simply disappears into a category called non-conformis. That word appears hundreds of times in old Vatican logs. Some items were too fragile, some too damaged, but others were simply too large. There are letters from the year 1672 describing bones discovered in the catacombs beneath Rome. The writer asks for guidance on how to record them. The reply from the Office of Records is brief. Do not measure, do not describe, seal and store. Why? Because to measure is to admit. To give shape to something is to make it real. And some truths, once given numbers, cannot be denied. Scientists who later tried to access those sealed crates found no documentation at all, no sketches, no photographs, just empty folders with pages removed. It was as if the act of recording had been undone. But silence is not emptiness, it is control. The absence of data creates obedience. If something has no scale, it cannot be compared. If it cannot be compared, it cannot be proven. And if it cannot be proven, it can quietly be forgotten. This was how the Church learned to guard the impossible, not with denial, but with bureaucracy. By controlling the forms, they controlled the truth. Some archivists whispered that the largest remains had been hidden in the subvaults of the Apostolic Archive, rooms without catalogue numbers, accessible only by papal order. The few who glimpsed the contents described faint outlines through the canvas of old crates. Long, curved shapes, ribs like arches, shadows too large to belong to anything known. But when asked to provide measurements, their reports always came back the same, dimensions unspecified. The most chilling part is that this method still exists. In modern databases, there are digital files labelled unverified relics with no metadata, no weight, no length, no photographs, just names. Silence given code, control disguised as order. Because as long as something cannot be measured, it cannot be proven real, and that is how the unexplainable survives. Not in glass cases or museums, but in the spaces left blank by those who were told not to measure. The greatest secret of the Vatican may not be what they found, but what they chose never to count. In the golden edges of medieval manuscripts, where monks painted saints and angels by candlelight, something strange often appeared. Between the vines and halos, hidden in the corners, were figures that did not fit, men taller than towers, striding beside the holy, holding tools the size of trees. For centuries, scholars said they were symbols, lessons about pride, imagination, or sin. But what if they were not imagination at all? What if they were memory? In the 12th century, artists in monasteries across Europe began filling the margins of sacred texts with detailed drawings. They showed beasts, miracles, and stories from Scripture. Yet some of those images showed things not found in any Bible. Giants standing beside apostles, carrying stones the size of altars, speaking to men half their height. They were drawn with the same care and reverence as the saints themselves. The strange part is that these figures appear in manuscripts from different regions that never directly influenced one another. England, France, Spain, and even distant Armenia all show the same towering shapes, sometimes with halos, sometimes without, but always beside the divine. One manuscript from the year 1293 describes them as the tall ones who remember. The text says they were the builders of the first temples and the keepers of the stars. It calls them those whose eyes saw before the flood. When the church later reviewed these manuscripts, many were quietly edited. The giants became metaphors for arrogance or the fall of man. Their names were changed to monsters, ogres, and demons. The art was left, but the meaning was rewritten. The monks who painted them never explained their choices, but in some diaries that survived, you can still read the small notes written in the margins. Next to one drawing of a giant standing beside a saint, a monk wrote, "We were not alone in the beginning." He never finished that page. Another wrote that he had seen bones in the monastery crypts too large for any man. He said they were kept behind sealed doors, only opened during feast days for secret prayer. When the Inquisition began hunting heresy, the old bestiaries and apocrypha containing these images were among the first to be burned. The church declared that the giants were fiction, remnants of pagan myths. Yet the pattern continued in art for centuries. Even Renaissance painters hid hints of them. In frescoes above cathedral altars, the proportions of certain figures are subtly off. Limbs too long, hands too broad, faces drawn slightly higher than human scale. It is as if artists were remembering something they were told to forget. Maybe the margins were not mistakes. Maybe they were warnings left by the few who still knew. The monks could not speak openly, but they could draw. They could hide truth in beauty. And somewhere in those pages, between angels and animals, is the memory of a world taller than ours, a world that once walked beside the holy, before faith learned to look down instead of up. In the year 1681, in a monastery outside Florence, a group of monks kept a secret notebook. It was bound in rough leather and written in a steady, practiced Latin hand. The title on the first page read simply, Anatomica Anomala. Inside were sketches of bones that should not exist. Femurs longer than a child, skulls with seams that curved like river branches, rib cages too wide for any known human form. The monks who wrote these notes were trained in anatomy. They dissected the dead to learn the shape of creation. But what they found one winter during the repair of a crypt forced them to question everything. Beneath the altar, inside a stone chamber sealed with wax, they uncovered a skeleton unlike any they had seen. The bones were pale and smooth, but enormous. The thigh bone measured more than 3 feet. The skull, heavy and thick, had an extra ridge above the eyes and a second seam across the crown. The monks measured, drew, and prayed. One wrote that the creature appeared human but not of Adam's line. Another wrote that its hands were too large, as if made for a body twice the height of man. They recorded every detail, but the notes were never published. Weeks later, an emissary from Rome arrived. He took the ledger, sealed the crypt again, and warned the monks never to speak of it. The ledger was thought lost until a single copy surfaced in the early 1900s in a private collection in Vienna. The pages were brittle, the ink fading, but the words were clear. One drawing showed the skull beside that of an ordinary man. The difference was staggering. Another page listed the weight of the bones, nearly double what normal human bones would bear. The margins contained faint Latin prayers, as if the writer was asking forgiveness for recording what he saw. Some historians now believe the ledger belonged to the Order of St. Camillus, a group known for their work in hospitals and burial grounds. Others think it was part of a hidden study sponsored by the church to classify unexplainable remains. What frightened them was not just the size, but the similarity. The bones were not animal. They were human in every recognizable way, only larger, stronger, older. The report ends with a final line, written in a trembling hand. The flesh of man is small, the memory of man is smaller. After that, the trail goes cold. The ledger disappeared again, possibly returned to the Vatican, possibly destroyed. But rumours persist that copies survive in private archives, passed between collectors who trade in forbidden relics. The drawings, they say, reveal something deeper than myth. The monks may not have understood what they found, but they knew it mattered, because when you hold a bone that does not fit any known frame, you are forced to ask a question older than faith itself. Who built the world before we were measured against it? In the spring of 1562, a pilgrim from France named Etienne du Lac arrived in Rome carrying a rolled parchment bound in crimson thread. He claimed it was copied from an older map kept by a dying monk in Avignon. The map showed the known catacombs beneath the Vatican, but there was something else drawn in ink the colour of dried blood. A narrow path marked with a single symbol, a ladder reaching up toward a star. At first glance, it looked like a devotional emblem, the kind pilgrims used to mark holy sites. But when Etienne traced the route with his finger, it led to a place no modern map recognised. The path began under St. Sebastian's catacombs, curved east toward the Tiber, and ended at a vault labelled Prohibita, the Forbidden Vault. No such chamber exists in official records. The church dismissed the map as false, yet some priests took interest. One of them, Father Bartolomeo Conti, copied the design into his own notes, writing that it matched old Roman legends about a sealed door beneath the hill of the Vatican. He wrote that the symbol of the ladder and star appeared again in mosaics hidden behind the altar of Santa Prassede, a church built for pilgrims in the 9th century. The star was always drawn above the ladder, as if inviting ascent instead of descent. Historians now see that symbol in other places, carved into stones where the Vatican's oldest walls meet the earth. Some believe it was a secret mark used by builders who mapped underground routes. Others think it was an emblem of an older brotherhood that guarded what lay below. The pilgrim's map was forgotten for centuries, until it resurfaced in 1931, purchased by a private collector in Turin. The parchment had darkened with age, but the lines remained visible under ultraviolet light. Experts confirmed that the ink contained traces of iron and gold, materials often used in sacred manuscripts meant to last forever. The path it described still aligned perfectly with known tunnels, except for the final turn, which ended beneath what is now the Apostolic Palace. The legend beside the symbol read in Latin, ascendere ad lucem, meaning to climb toward the light. Archaeologists who tried to follow the route found blocked corridors, bricked walls, and a faint smell of limestone dust. Some said they felt air moving from behind the stone, as if the tunnels continued beyond what was sealed. The Vatican denied all access soon after, declaring the passages unsafe. But rumours say the star mark still appears in hidden corners of the basilica, carved by hands centuries apart. A ladder to the heavens drawn underground, pointing not down to the dead, but up to something remembered. If the Forbidden Vault exists, it was not meant for relics or saints. It was built for something older, something that once walked upright beneath the earth and reached for the stars before faith told us to kneel. Every civilization has told the same story in a different way. The world was washed clean, the sky broke open, the waters rose, and the old ones vanished. In the Bible, it was the flood of Noah. In Mesopotamia, it was the deluge of Utnapishtim. In Greece, it was the drowning of the Titans. Each version ends with a promise that life would begin again, smaller, weaker, humbled. But hidden inside those stories is something no one ever asks. Who was the world built for before the flood? In every myth, the survivors remember beings who stood higher than houses, who built cities from stone no modern hand could lift, who carved mountains into temples. When the waters came, they disappeared, and humanity began again from the pieces left behind. The flood became not only a punishment, but an eraser, a reset button pressed by time itself. And the most dangerous part is that it keeps happening. After every cataclysm, people rebuild smaller. They cut stones thinner. They tell stories that make their ancestors ordinary. The past shrinks each time it is remembered. We call it progress, but what if it is reduction? Ancient tablets from Sumer describe kings who ruled for thousands of years before the Great Flood. After it, their reigns lasted mere decades. The scale of life itself was rewritten. Historians dismiss this as exaggeration, but the pattern repeats everywhere. The Mayans, the Hindus, even early Christians spoke of ages that ended in fire and water, followed by shorter lives and smaller bodies. It is as if every reset compresses the world a little more. And if the flood erased the giants, maybe it was not nature alone that did it. Maybe someone wanted to rewrite the scale of creation. The Vatican holds the oldest collection of flood records known to exist. Hidden among them are fragments that suggest the Church once believed the deluge was more than divine punishment. It was described as a calibration, a return to balance, a way to hide what came before. In one banned text attributed to a monk named Theophilus in the 14th century, the flood is called the second measurement. He wrote that before the waters, man was tall enough to touch the trees and speak to the stars. Afterward, he was taught to bend his knees so he would never try again. Modern science speaks of lost epochs, of ice ages and rising seas that erased entire coastlines. Yet somehow, the oldest structures still defy explanation. The stones of Baalbek, the pyramids, the Cyclopean walls of Peru, all built for a scale that no longer exists. Maybe the flood was not only water, but will, a choice made by those who feared what came before. Because if the world once held giants, their memory still lingers in stone, in myth, in silence. The question is not if they existed, but who edited the story to make us small enough to forget them. They were not priests, not scientists, and not soldiers. They were something in between. Inside the deepest levels of the Vatican archive, there is a name whispered quietly among those who work the night shifts. The custodians. No records list them, no documents confirm them. Yet their presence is felt in the sealed rooms and the unmarked corridors where the air smells of dust and iron. Their purpose is simple, at least on the surface. They protect what cannot be shown, but the truth of their oath runs far deeper. They are said to guard a collection known only as the oversized relics, objects and remains that challenge the scale of human history, bones that stretch beyond reason, tools too large for human hands, tablets carved in a script that does not match any known language. According to those who claim to have met one, each custodian takes a vow of silence that lasts a lifetime. They do not preach, they do not write, and they never speak of what they see. Their oath binds them not to the church, but to the idea of balance. Protect faith from fracture or truth from misuse. It sounds noble, but it hides a deep fear. Because truth, once revealed, cannot be contained. There is a story told by a former Vatican worker who claimed to have met an old man in the catacombs wearing a dark cassock without a cross. The man spoke Latin fluently, but carried no name tag, no title. When asked what his duty was, he replied softly, "I keep the silence standing." Then he walked away and disappeared behind a locked iron gate. The custodians are said to pass their positions through initiation, not through rank. A priest, a scholar, a guard, anyone could be chosen if they show the right kind of loyalty. The training is not written, only spoken, whispered from one to the next. They are taught how to catalogue what should not exist, how to move artifacts without leaving traces, and how to bury knowledge inside knowledge so that even if something is found, its meaning remains hidden. In one secret letter, dated 1849, an anonymous cardinal described the custodians as the final wall between revelation and ruin. He wrote that if the oversized relics were ever revealed to the public, every doctrine built on human origin would tremble. The church would survive, he said, but faith would not. Some believe the custodians are not just protecting the Vatican, but the world itself. Because if mankind saw proof that another race, larger and older, once walked this earth, it could break the fragile story of who we think we are. The oath is not about secrecy for power. It is secrecy for stability. Yet every generation risks one custodian who doubts the silence. one who looks at the giant bones and wonders if the truth they hide is not a threat to faith, but its beginning. Perhaps the greatest danger is not the relics themselves, but the fear that has kept them in the dark. In every cathedral, there are bones behind glass. A finger of a saint, a fragment of a rib, a lock of hair. Each relic is measured not by size, but by sanctity. The faithful never ask how these measurements were made, but once, long ago, someone did. In the year 1578, a craftsman named Lorenzo di Paolo was hired to build a reliquary for a bone said to belong to Saint Christopher. The record still survives in a forgotten archive of Florence. It says Lorenzo requested the dimensions of the relic so he could carve the case precisely. The letter he received in return contained only one line: "Build it larger than reason." When the bone finally arrived, he understood why. It was not the size of a finger, it was the size of an arm. Smooth, heavy, and pale, it curved like a bow, far thicker than any human bone. Lorenzo was confused. If this was truly the arm of a saint, then the saint had been twice the height of any man. He questioned the priests, but they told him that Saint Christopher was known as the giant who carried Christ across the river, and that this relic was proof of his greatness. Still, Lorenzo wrote in his diary that the joint structure looked nothing like a human radius. It resembled something closer to the femur of an extinct beast. Yet the church paid him well to silence his doubts. The relic was placed in a gilded glass case and carried in procession every year for decades. Over time, the crowds forgot its size. The story of the giant became metaphor, not memory. The relic remained untouched, unmeasured. In the early 1800s, a group of scholars examined old reliquaries across Italy and noticed a strange pattern. Some of the largest relics, attributed to saints of immense strength or miracles, were anatomically impossible. Bones too long, joints that did not align with the human form. One researcher quietly suggested that these might not be human remains at all, but remnants of an older race absorbed into the myth of sainthood. His findings were never published. The Vatican confiscated the samples, claiming they were mislabeled relics of animals. Yet the detailed drawings from those studies still exist in private collections. The bones show proportions that fit neither human nor known animal anatomy. They belong to something else, something between the two. It raises a troubling question. How many relics in the church's vaults once belonged to giants and were rebranded as holy simply because they could not be explained? Faith measures holiness in miracles, but nature measures reality in size. When the two collide, only one can be seen. The other is hidden, renamed, or locked away. A relic too large for its reliquary is more than an artifact. It is a confession carved in bone, a silent admission that history was once bigger than belief. Across Europe, there are chapels so old that even the priests who serve them no longer know who built them. Their stones are rough and uneven, their ceilings low, but their walls speak a language time forgot. Beneath layers of plaster and candle smoke, faint carvings appear, symbols that look like letters but not from Latin, Greek or Hebrew. They twist and curve like vines, as if written by hands that had seen something different in the world. In one chapel near the border of France and Switzerland, a team of restorers uncovered a set of these carvings in 1957. At first, they thought the marks were decorative, but when light hit them at dusk, they formed a word. It repeated 3 times on the same wall, carved deeper each time. The word was unreadable to modern scholars, but an old linguist from Prague noticed something. It resembled a fragment found in a pre-Christian tablet discovered in Anatolia centuries earlier. The translation he offered was chilling. It could mean first people, or tall kin, or simply witness. The church dismissed the claim, calling it coincidence, yet the same word began appearing elsewhere, on the lintel of a crumbling chapel in Spain. On a stone pillar buried in an Irish monastery garden, even on the floor of an abandoned crypt beneath Rome itself. Always the same script, always the same impossible word. The carvings seem to describe figures larger than men, bending the branches of trees, holding objects shaped like suns. Some show smaller people kneeling before them, not in fear, but in reverence. It is as if these carvings were not meant as warnings but as memories. The language has no known alphabet, but when analysed by pattern recognition software decades later, its symbols aligned with rhythmic sequences found in music and mathematics. That means whoever wrote them understood pattern, sound, and proportion in ways that predate known written language. Scholars who examined the carvings quietly suggested that this could be a proto-script belonging to an earlier civilization, erased from history. But when the findings were presented to church historians in 1971, the response was swift. The documents were archived, the chapel sealed, and the linguist who led the study was reassigned. Officially, the carvings were labelled decorative damage caused by erosion, yet the local villagers still call that chapel La Casa dei Testimoni, the House of the Witnesses. They say, at midnight, when the candles go out and the bells stop ringing, you can hear a low hum in the stone, like the echo of a forgotten prayer. The old tongue may never be fully read, but perhaps it was never meant to be. Maybe it was carved not for us, but for memory itself. A message from those who came before, waiting for a world small enough to forget them and curious enough to start remembering again. In a small coastal village in southern Italy, there is an old church with a strange mural painted above its altar. It shows a man in robes holding a staff, standing beside a figure so tall his head nearly touches the bells carved into the ceiling. Locals say the painting tells the story of Saint Mercian, a missionary who, according to legend, converted a giant. The story appears in a few crumbling manuscripts from the 12th century, written in a mixture of Latin and early Italian. They describe how Mercian was travelling through the mountains when he met a man as high as the bell tower, whose voice was like thunder rolling through the stone. At first, the people feared him, believing he was a beast, but Mercian saw in him something else. The texts say he baptized the giant in a mountain spring, giving him a name that roughly translates to Brother of Light. After that, the records fade into myth. The next entry describes how Mercian's church was built from the giant's own hands. Stones so heavy no ordinary men could lift them were set into perfect arches in a single day. The church later called it metaphor, saying the giant symbolized the conversion of pagans, not a literal being, but certain details make the story harder to dismiss. In the foundation of that same church, archaeologists found a femur far larger than any human bone. When news of the discovery reached Rome in 1932, the relic was taken to the Vatican for study. It was never seen again. Official statements said it had turned out to be an animal fossil, yet those who handled it before it was removed said it was smooth, hollow, and unmistakably human in shape. The legend of the saint and the colossus faded into folklore, but nearby villages still tell a version of it where the giant did not die, but simply walked into the sea after the baptism, promising to return when the church had forgotten his name. On the feast day of Saint Mercian, the bell tower is rung 13 times, one more than tradition requires. The 13th toll, the priest says, is for the missing brother. Hidden in the Vatican library is a short note by a 17th century monk who studied the legend. He wrote that the story had been edited to remove details about the giant's tribe, a race known to inhabit the high mountains before the flood. His words were crossed out, his work unpublished. Whether St. Mercian's tale was faith or fact, it leaves behind an unsettling idea. Maybe the saints we remember were not just men who healed the sick and preached to kings. Maybe some of them walked among beings we were told could not exist, and their miracles were simply the moments when two worlds met and one was ordered to vanish. In the summer of 1736, a Jesuit missionary named Father Matteo Loria led an expedition into the mountains of Anatolia. His goal was to map forgotten monasteries, and recover Christian relics rumoured to have survived the Ottoman Wars. But what he found was something else entirely. His field journal, discovered 2 centuries later in a Jesuit archive in Avignon, describes a cavern sealed by rock slides and marked with symbols that no one in his party could recognise. Inside, by torchlight, they found what he called a tomb of impossible scale. Rows of skeletons lay in stone alcoves carved into the mountain itself, each bone longer than a man's arm. In one entry he wrote, "Their skulls are like domes, and the femurs could serve as beams for a church roof. These were not men, but something greater. A race that walked over us like bridges." He estimated their height at nearly 12 feet, though he admitted that such numbers defied belief. Fearing desecration, Father Loria ordered the remains to be documented and sealed. Yet one crate, labelled simply specimens, was packed and sent toward Rome for examination by the Jesuit Curia. That crate was never seen again. The surviving journal pages note that it was last reported aboard a small ship crossing the Adriatic. A storm was said to have sunk it, though no wreck was ever found. The shipping records, however, tell a stranger story. The crate's identification number matches a manifest entry signed by a Vatican courier who later took a position in the secret archive. His name appears nowhere else. Decades later, a monk working in the same archive mentioned a wooden box stored in the restricted section. Inside, he claimed, were bones of unusual proportion, yet not animal. When asked where they had come from, the archivist replied only, "From a place where faith and scale could not agree." Father Loria never returned to the mountains. His superiors reassigned him to a quiet post in southern France, where he died a year later. His final letter, written to a fellow Jesuit, contains a single cryptic line. The bridges sleep beneath the stone, and the church walks over them still. For centuries, the story was dismissed as legend, another missionary fantasy, like the lost tribes of Israel or the giants of Canaan. But the coordinates in Loria's notes match a real mountain range, and local shepherds still speak of hollow caves where the air smells like iron and the ground hums faintly at night. Whether the bones were washed away, stolen, or hidden, no one knows. Yet somewhere between those mountains and the vaults of Rome, the crate vanished into silence. Perhaps it never sank at all. Perhaps it arrived, was catalogued, and locked away with the others. Another relic, too large to fit the story we were taught to believe. There is a reason the oldest secrets are buried and not burned. Fire draws attention. Smoke invites questions. But stone, silence, and time can hide anything. The Church learned this long ago. When a truth is too heavy to destroy, you put it beneath the ground. You let centuries press down on it until even memory forgets where it sleeps. That is the logic of burial. It is not erasure. It is control. Every vault beneath the Vatican was built with that same idea in mind. Knowledge is like fire, beautiful but dangerous. A truth too large can collapse the story holding the world together. So they learned to weigh it down, not by denial, but by preservation. The secret archives were never about hiding lies. They were about hiding proofs. Inside those halls, the stone itself becomes part of the theology. It says to the world, if you cannot see it, you cannot question it. One Vatican document from the 15th century describes the process plainly. When an artifact bears the burden of contradiction, it shall not be broken nor displayed, but enclosed, that its existence may be preserved without temptation. In other words, keep it, but bury it deep enough that no one will dig it up again. Over time, this became a kind of sacred policy. Objects that did not fit the narrative were locked away. Books that described impossible creatures or enormous bones were sealed under marble floors. Witnesses who saw too much were assigned to monasteries where silence was part of the vow. It was not cruelty. It was fear disguised as faith. A bishop in the year 1690 wrote in his journal that some truths are too heavy for the hearts of men. He meant that literally. He had seen bones that could not be explained and chose to bury them under a new chapel. The altar still stands there today. People kneel on it every Sunday, unaware that under their feet lies something that could rewrite their entire understanding of the world. That is the weight of a secret. Once it becomes too great to carry, it becomes architecture. Cathedrals rise over forgotten vaults, not out of reverence, but out of necessity. The stones keep the silence intact. Even today, excavation in Rome often uncovers sealed chambers that no one can explain. Foundations built over older ruins, layers upon layers of time and intention. Each one hides a story someone decided humanity was not ready to hear. Burial became not just a method, but a philosophy, because when one truth can topple a story, you do not destroy it, you entomb it. You give it a name that no one will translate, a key that no one will use, and you trust that centuries of dust will do the rest. The world above moves on, and the secret sleeps below, perfectly preserved in the darkness, waiting for a generation brave enough or foolish enough to lift the stone. Across Europe, labyrinths appear in places they should not just on the floors of cathedrals, but carved into walls, etched into old maps, and traced in fields that have long since turned to dust. The most famous lies in Chartres Cathedral, a stone maze set into the floor, walked by pilgrims for centuries. But when the lines are measured precisely, something strange happens. The spiral does not point toward the altar, or even toward Jerusalem, as tradition says. It points upward, toward the constellation Orion. The same pattern appears again in Compostela, in a lesser-known chapel hidden behind the main pilgrimage route. Its layout mirrors the stars of the same constellation. And deep beneath Rome, inside the catacombs that stretch for miles under the Vatican, there are faint carvings on the walls that trace the same lines. 3 labyrinths in 3 cities, all connected by geometry that predates Christianity itself. Ancient builders used labyrinths as more than decoration. They were maps of movement, blueprints for walking between worlds. But the proportions of these particular designs do not match the stride of a normal person. Each turn, each loop, is too wide, as if meant for steps twice as long. Some researchers believe the labyrinths were meant to be symbolic, a path to enlightenment, but others see something else, a memory carved in stone, a record of beings who built for longer strides. In the early 20th century, a French historian named René Dubois discovered that the Chartres labyrinth perfectly aligns with a star chart from around 10,000 years ago, a time when the Earth's axis was slightly different. That means whoever designed it knew not only the stars, but their movements through time. When Dubois tried to publish his findings, his paper was quietly pulled. His notes mention a Vatican official who advised him to abandon the project for his own good. He never worked again. The geometry itself remains undeniable. Lines connecting Chartres, Compostela, and Rome form a triangle that mirrors Orion's belt. The distances between them match the ratios of the stars. It is as if the cathedrals were built to echo the heavens, or perhaps to honour something that once came from them. Old manuscripts from the 13th century call the labyrinths the ladders of light, paths walked by angels or by those who remembered walking beside them. Later church translations changed the word ladder to pilgrimage, but the original meaning may have been closer to ascent, a way up, a way back. Hidden beneath the feet of worshippers, the patterns still whisper the same message. The builders were not just architects. They were remembering something lost, something taller than legend, something that once reached for the stars, not as dreamers, but as those who could. And perhaps the labyrinths were never meant to trap the faithful, but to remind them of a time when humanity walked in longer steps, and the heavens were only a staircase away. When you step into a cathedral, the first thing you notice is not the light or the stone, but the sound. Every whisper lingers, every footstep becomes a note, the air hums as if alive. Architects say this is the genius of design, the careful shaping of domes and vaults to amplify the human voice until it sounds divine. But what if those spaces were not made for our voices at all? What if they were tuned for something larger? In the oldest sanctuaries of Europe, the proportions are not accidental. The ceilings rise to impossible heights, the walls curve like the inside of a ribcage, and the echo lasts just long enough to return as harmony. Modern acousticians studying Chartres, Notre Dame, and the Basilica of Saint-Denis discovered that the resonance frequencies of their naves align with tones produced by voices far deeper than the average human range, the kind of notes that shake the chest more than the ear. When sung, those frequencies cause the stone itself to vibrate. The builders knew this. They left hints in the carvings above choir stalls and in the measurements of the pillars. Some cathedrals even have narrow hidden corridors behind the altars, where sound can travel in circles. Standing there, you can hear a whisper magnified into a chorus, but the mystery is older than the cathedrals. In Romanesque churches built before the 12th century, the acoustic design favours voices that come from bodies at least twice the size of ours. A modern singer cannot fill the space the way it was intended. The sound never reaches the ceiling. It dies halfway up, as if the architecture is waiting for a longer breath, a deeper chest, a lost choir. In 1968, an engineer named Paolo Farini tested the echo chamber beneath an abandoned abbey in Tuscany. When he played a frequency below 60 Hz, the stone walls resonated perfectly, as if answering. The sound resembled the vibration produced by a massive human voice, something no living person could create. The abbey's blueprints reveal that the builders intentionally shaped the vault to amplify those tones. Farini wrote that the design felt less like worship and more like communication, as if the structure itself was meant to sing back. Later studies found similar patterns in monasteries across Europe. The same ratios, the same echo length, the same impossible acoustics. The church explains it as artistic inspiration, a search for heaven in sound, but the numbers tell another story. These spaces were not built for us, they were inherited. Restorers often find stones from older foundations buried beneath cathedrals, too large to have been moved by the tools of the time. Some believe they were remnants of temples built by a race that understood sound as power. Maybe the chants and hymns we still sing are echoes of something older. A memory of voices that once filled the air completely. The choir of long shadows may not be gone. It may just be waiting for its singers to grow tall enough to reach the note again. In the year 1472, a monk named Brother Aldo copied an old chronicle for the Abbey of Monte Cassino. His job was simple, to preserve the words of older scribes before the pages crumbled into dust. But in the margin of one page, he left something that was not part of the text, a list of measurements. Teeth as wide as 3 denarii, jawbone length of 16 fingers, crown diameter larger than a man's shoulders. Beside the notes, he drew a small sketch of a crown, crude but clear, far too large for any human head. For centuries, no one noticed the scribble. It was rediscovered in the 1900s when scholars restored the manuscript, now brittle with age. Most dismissed it as exaggeration or allegory, but the details were too precise to ignore. The denarius was a Roman coin, about 2 centimeters wide. That would make each tooth nearly 6 centimeters across, the size of a child's hand. The writing style matches Aldo's own careful Latin, not playful invention. He was describing something real. The question is, what? Legends from that region tell of a tomb found during the rebuilding of the abbey after an earthquake in the 14th century. Workers uncovered a stone sarcophagus sealed with a bronze clasp engraved with stars. Inside were bones, enormous and pale. The jaw alone was large enough to hold both hands inside. The abbot ordered the find reburied under the altar, declaring it the remains of an ancient king. To preserve the sanctity of the abbey, he renamed the site and forbade further digging. Brother Aldo's notes appear roughly a century later. Perhaps he had seen the bones or the crown himself passed down through quiet hands. Some say he served as the keeper of relics and had access to what lay beneath the chapel. His sketch of the crown shows a band of metal shaped with 7 points, each ending in a small orb. Later descriptions of pre-Christian kings from the Lombard legends describe crowns just like it, but on heads too large for men. In a forgotten section of the Vatican's relic inventory, there is a record from 1631 that lists an object retrieved from Monte Cassino marked as regnum incongruum, which means crown of unfit measure. It was never displayed, never photographed, and its location today is unknown. The teeth, if they survived, would have been the size of marble carvings. Some believe they were ground down to powder, mixed with gold to make relic dust. Others whisper that they are still locked in a reliquary, mislabeled as the jaw of a saint. The crown remains the most haunting clue, a symbol of rule that no man could wear. Perhaps Brother Aldo knew that, and wrote his notes not to record the impossible, but to warn those who came after. That the kings who first ruled the world might have been giants, and their crowns still rest somewhere under the church, waiting for a head large enough to claim them again. Every empire has rewritten its own history to make itself the center of the story. But the church went further. It rewrote the scale of humanity itself. In the beginning, it was not about faith or science, it was about size. The doctrine of scale is never written in Scripture, yet it is carved into every cathedral and printed in every catechism. It says man is the measure of creation, not angels, not titans, not forgotten races, but man alone. And once that measure is fixed, anything larger must be myth, anything older must be sin. This is how power maintains itself, by deciding how big the past is allowed to be. Before the 15th century, manuscripts from across Europe described people who lived in ages of greater stature and longer life. Their bones were said to rest beneath mountains, their tools to form the foundations of cities. But when the Renaissance brought new rulers and a new church, those stories began to shrink. Giants became metaphors. Legends turned into moral lessons. Painters who once depicted enormous beings walking beside saints began to scale them down, until they fit neatly within the frame of man. Architecture followed. Ancient temples, with doors towering 15 feet high, were called symbols of pride rather than remnants of proportion. The Vatican declared that creation was complete and humanity had always been the same. The age of giants became a parable of hubris. The shift seems harmless until you realize what it erased. Once the measure of man became law, everything outside it became unrecordable. The church no longer needed to burn evidence. It simply had to ignore what was too big to fit. Skeletons found in quarries or catacombs were labelled monsters. Tools too large to use were said to be miracles or mistakes. Over time, even scientists adopted the same rule without question. Modern anthropology was built on the assumption that human proportions have always been what they are now. No one asked who decided that. The doctrine of scale became invisible, passed down through education and architecture, shaping not only how we see the past but how we see ourselves. In this doctrine, belief is not measured by faith, but by conformity. You must fit inside the frame. You must match the story. Anything that exceeds it is dangerous. A priest once wrote that the devil's greatest lie was to make men think they were gods, but perhaps the greater lie was to make gods think they were men. The reduction of scale was not just about denying giants. It was about controlling imagination. Because once you believe that nothing larger ever walked the earth, you stop looking for what still might. The walls of the Vatican are high, but not just to guard what is inside. They are meant to remind us of our size. And if one day the stones crumble, and the world sees how big the truth really was, the doctrine of scale will finally break, and with it, the illusion that the story of man ever fit neatly inside its own skin. Bones remember things flesh forgets. They hold the record of every step, every blow, every year. To most people, they are just relics of death, but to those who study them, bones are living archives. They teach without words. Every ridge and scar tells a story. Every line of wear is a sentence carved by time. In the secret chambers beneath Rome, where the Vatican keeps its most unusual finds, there are bones that do not match the human pattern. They are longer, heavier, and marked by strange lines that seem to shimmer faintly under light. For years, these anomalies were dismissed as distortions caused by mineral deposits or geological pressure. But when a small group of anthropologists examined photographs of them in the early 1900s, they noticed something that could not be explained away. The bones had growth rings, like trees. Rings formed by cycles of time far longer than a human life. That means they belonged to beings who lived for centuries. More surprising were the fractures. Some had healed perfectly, showing that the creatures had survived injuries that would have killed an ordinary person. These were not mythical giants. They were living beings who aged, worked, and endured. The bones show stress patterns similar to those of people who carried heavy loads or walked great distances. The knees are worn, the spines compressed, suggesting long years of movement. These were builders, travellers, perhaps labourers in an age when the world was still young. Their skulls, when compared to human ones, reveal thicker brows and stronger jaws, but also wider cranial cavities. Larger heads meant larger brains. Whatever they were not monsters. They were teachers carved in calcium. If you listen closely, they tell a different version of history, one where humanity was not alone, but part of a continuum. Over time, their remains became the foundation of myth. The Nephilim, the Titans, the Watchers, different names for the same truth. The Church labelled them allegory because the evidence did not fit the doctrine of scale. But bones cannot be silenced forever. Even buried, they hum with memory. In 2003, a fragment reportedly surfaced in a private collection in northern Italy. Scientists who tested it found traces of proteins consistent with human DNA, but with unusual density and resilience. It was as if the bone had evolved beyond fragility, designed to last. Maybe that is why their stories survived so long, because their bodies were built to outlive the lie that erased them. When you hold a bone in your hand, you are touching the memory of weight, the memory of a being who walked, fell, healed, and stood again. These are not symbols, they are lessons. The bones that teach remind us that the world once held more than we can measure. They ask only that we listen, not with faith or fear, but with wonder. Because truth, like bone, endures, even when buried and when unearthed. It speaks in the oldest language of all, silence made solid. The Church never feared monsters. It knew how to deal with monsters. It turned them into demons, chained them to myths, and used them as lessons against sin. What it feared were elders, beings who came before, who remembered the world differently, who could look at the story of man and say, "This is not how it began." Elders cannot be cast as evil because they are too human. They bleed, they build, they think. They simply stand taller, live longer, and remember more. And that memory is dangerous. If giants once walked among us, they were not children of chaos but our older brothers. To admit their existence would mean that humanity was not the first creation but the second. That our civilization is not the foundation but the continuation of something older. Authority depends on being the origin of truth. Elders erase that. They make every pope, every king, every scholar look like an heir pretending to be a founder. That is why they were hidden. Not because they were monstrous, but because they were proof that knowledge did not begin in Rome or Jerusalem, but long before either city was born. Ancient texts from Mesopotamia, Greece, and Egypt all describe a first generation of beings who taught men how to build, farm, and write. The Bible calls them the Nephilim. The Greeks called them the Titans. The Egyptians spoke of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. The pattern is always the same. The elders rise, they teach, and then they vanish. The younger races inherit their world and pretend it was always theirs. When the Vatican rose to power, it could not allow the idea of older teachers to survive. Faith requires a single creation, a single covenant, a single line from God to man. Anything before that is noise. So the giants became legend, and their remains became relics buried under cathedrals. Even their stories were rewritten. The helpers became rebels, the builders became abominations. But the bones remain, and bones do not lie. Imagine what would happen if the world accepted that humans once lived beside beings twice their size, wiser, stronger, patient as mountains. It would force every belief system to redraw its origin. Every hierarchy would shake. The priest would no longer speak for heaven if another race once did it better. That is the real fear, the fear of the elder brother, not his strength, but his memory, because he remembers the mistakes we keep repeating. He remembers the floods, the fires, the towers that fell, and he knows that every civilization eventually forgets that it was not first. The elders are gone, but their silence is deliberate. Perhaps they left when they saw that their younger kin needed to learn through loss. Or, perhaps, they were buried by those who could not stand to look up at them. Either way, the truth remains. Giants were not hidden to protect us from them. They were hidden to protect power from truth. Imagine walking down a corridor that few have ever seen. The air grows colder with each step, the lights dim, and the hum of the modern world fades behind stone. You reach a door made of black iron, smooth and silent. It bears no handle, only a small cross etched in its center. This is the entrance to what some call the Black Vault. Officially, it does not exist, but every archivist in the Vatican has heard whispers of it. The place where things too dangerous, too strange, or too large for explanation are kept. The door opens with a sound like distant thunder, and inside the air tastes of dust and tannin, the smell of time itself. The room stretches farther than you expect. Shelves rise to the ceiling, filled with crates marked in fading Latin. Some bear dates written in ink so old it has turned brown. Others have symbols instead of words, circles, eyes, and stars. You run your hand along one crate and feel the grooves of a name carved by hand, a script that refuses to belong to any century. The light flickers. Somewhere in the darkness, a drop of water echoes against stone. It feels less like a storage room and more like a tomb, but not for bodies, for truths. On a nearby shelf lies a crate marked Anomalum 16, sealed with red wax. A paper tag hangs from it, written in delicate script. Within, preserved under linen, lies part of a femur too long to fit the length of the box. Its surface is smooth and pale, showing faint patterns of growth, like the rings of a tree. Another box contains fragments of metal, shaped like vertebrae, as if someone had tried to mimic the human spine in bronze. Deeper in the vault, jars of yellowed liquid hold what look like preserved organs, labelled in shorthand only a few scholars could read. The handwriting belongs to a man long dead, yet the ink feels fresh, as if it refuses to age. A single table stands in the centre of the room. On it rests an open ledger, its pages filled with precise measurements written in both metric and something older. Every few lines end with the same Latin phrase, non mensurandum, not to be measured. The deeper you go, the stranger it becomes. The shelves start to bend under the weight of boxes too heavy for their frames. The air hums faintly, like distant music under the silence. You realize you are not in a room, but in a timeline, a place where the forgotten is stored to keep the present from collapsing. Perhaps this is what the custodians see when they speak of balance. The vault is not a prison. It is a warning, a reminder that truth can live only when kept still. And yet, standing there among the sealed crates and ancient dust, you cannot help but wonder what would happen if the door one day opened for everyone, if the world finally saw what the Vatican chose to hide. Cathedrals were built to hold heaven, but what if they were also built to hold the dead? not just saints or kings, but something far older. Beneath their marble floors, under the echo of choirs and the weight of stained glass, there are chambers that no pilgrim ever sees. Some say these vaults are empty, others say they are filled with relics, but a few old maps suggest something stranger. They show the naves of the great cathedrals aligned directly over ancient burial grounds, tombs that predate Christianity itself. It is as if each new church was placed not simply to honour the past, but to seal it. Architecture is cemetery, stone that sings over bones that silence. In Chartres, excavations beneath the crypt revealed enormous sarcophagi built of limestone blocks so heavy they could not have been moved by medieval tools. The official explanation called them pagan remains reused by early builders, but the stones bear carvings of spirals and hands larger than human size. Beneath St. Peter's in Rome, the substructures grow darker and wider the deeper one goes. Scholars studying the foundations found arches that lead nowhere, filled with gravel and cement, as if someone had intentionally closed them off. Some of those sealed chambers lie directly under the main altar. Priests once called them the sleeping vaults, but no one could say what was sleeping. The pattern repeats across Europe. Cathedral after cathedral built upon forgotten tombs, each new layer of faith resting like a lid on the one before. The ground remembers even when the living do not. Acoustic engineers once tested the vibrations in Notre Dame before the fire of 2019. They discovered that the entire structure resonates at a low frequency that mirrors the heartbeat of a living body. When the great bells ring, the vibration reaches deep into the earth, as if awakening something below. Perhaps it was by design. Perhaps the builders knew that sound could keep what was buried from rising. Ancient texts describe a ritual called the singing of the stone, a practice meant to calm the spirits of the old world. The cathedral might not only be a house of worship, but also a tombstone for a buried race. Every hymn, every echo, every prayer layered above the bones, keeping them silent through sound. There are legends of workers who disappeared during construction, swallowed by the crypts below. Some said they found bones larger than themselves, arranged not in chaos, but in patterns, like guardians lying in wait. If that is true, then the cathedrals are more than monuments. They are coffins for gods who once walked among men, buried under the faith that replaced them. The stones rise toward heaven to distract the eyes from what sleeps beneath. And when the choirs sing, their voices do more than praise. They weigh the air with harmony, pressing the silence back into the ground. Because even in death, the giants might still listen, waiting for the day the last note fades and the stone finally cracks. Faith has always feared rulers, not kings, but measurements, because once you measure something, you can compare it. You can prove what is larger, smaller, older, or truer. The church built its foundation on perfect proportion, the divine symmetry of man made in the image of God. Every painting, every cathedral, every verse was designed to fit that idea. But somewhere in the vaults of the Vatican lies the one thing that does not fit: a tibia, longer than a man is tall, smooth, heavy, and real. The most dangerous scripture is not written in ink. It is written in bone. Proportions prove proportions wrong. The Renaissance made man the measure of all things. Artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo sketched human perfection as geometry, arms outstretched in a circle, a mirror of the universe. But what happens when something walks into the story that breaks the circle? A body that does not fit the sacred grid, a being that stands too tall to belong to creation, as defined by doctrine. That is heresy, not of belief, but of proportion. Because the moment you admit one exception, the entire equation collapses. The archives hold reports of discoveries the church never explained. Bones unearthed during construction, femurs longer than any man, skulls too large for any frame. They were never studied publicly. Instead, they were stored, sealed, and erased from inventory. A document from 1693, describes such a find beneath a monastery in Umbria. The monk who recorded it wrote, "If this belongs to man, then our books are wrong." He was reassigned to silence within the year. The bones vanished soon after. What the church understood, and what science later forgot, is that proportion defines power. To be the measure of creation is to control it. If giants existed, then man was not the center. He was an echo. That truth was intolerable. So the measurements were adjusted, the evidence buried, the stories turned into metaphors. When people today see drawings of giants beside saints, they think of fantasy. But in those old paintings, the artists were telling what they saw. They measured with their eyes, not their doctrines. Their brushstrokes were confessions. Even nature seems to hint at a larger scale once known. Ancient doorways carved too high, stairways with risers too deep, tools that require arms longer than ours. The world was once built for bigger hands. When archaeologists measure them, the numbers defy logic, and logic is rewritten to fit faith in modern form. We still practice the same heresy of proportion, but in reverse. We shrink the past to make the present comfortable. Because if we ever hold that giant tibia in our hands and weigh it against our own, we will see how small our understanding has been. And maybe that is what frightens us most. Not that giants once existed, but that we have spent so long pretending to be their size. Every culture remembers them, though the names have changed. In Egypt, they were the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. In Greece, they were the Titans. In Sumer, they were the Apkallu, the wise ones who rose from the sea to teach writing and architecture. In the Americas, they became the Viracocha, tall bearded men who brought order and stone to the Andes. And in every story they leave the same way, quietly, without war, walking into the horizon when humanity turns away. The tall memory is not a single myth. It is a pattern that repeats like an echo across time. These figures arrive after chaos, rebuild the world, teach language, numbers, and song, and then disappear once men claim their knowledge as their own. Some say they came from the stars. Others say they were simply the last survivors of a forgotten age, the elders of a world destroyed by flood and fire. Whatever they were, their memory stands taller than myth. Archaeologists have found traces of the same measurements in monuments built oceans apart. The ratio of the Great Pyramid of Giza matches that of the temples of Teotihuacan. The stones of Baalbek fit the same pattern as those in Cusco. Cultures that never met somehow built to the same rhythm, as if they were all following the same teacher. Legends describe those teachers as giants, but not in the monstrous sense. They were described as noble, calm, voices deep as thunder, eyes bright as dawn. They spoke of harmony, of aligning stone with sky, of building as prayer. Their craft was not just physical but sacred geometry, the art of remembering through proportion. But then, something changed. Humanity began to worship its own reflection. The gods became smaller, closer, jealous of power. The temples built for the stars became churches built for men. The teachers left, taking their measure with them. Some traditions say they promised to return when man remembered how to listen. The church could not allow those stories to remain. Giants who built in the name of balance did not fit the theology of dominion, so the tall ones became myths, their monuments became mysteries, and their memory was reduced to parables. Yet their fingerprints remain on the planet, stones too large for us to move, songs tuned to frequencies we cannot reproduce, and maps of constellations drawn before our civilization could name them. The tall memory whispers that the human story did not begin at the top of the ladder, but halfway up it, that once we learned from those who had already climbed higher. And perhaps that is why the Vatican hides the bones. Not because they belong to monsters, but because they belong to teachers who remind us how small we have become. If they walked away when we chose smaller gods, then remembering them is not heresy, it is humility. The kind that makes us look up again, not in worship, but in recognition. One day, the door will open, not the one made of iron or stone, but the one built of silence, the door that has stood between what we believe and what we have forgotten. When it finally opens, there will be no trumpet, no collapse of walls, no flash of light, only the sound of dust shifting, the quiet sigh of history exhaling after centuries of being held in its breath. Inside will not be monsters. There will be bones, pale and strong, arranged like sentences waiting to be read. The bones will not lie. They will not argue. They will only remind us of what has always been true. That truth stands taller than the stories built to contain it. For generations, we have knelt beneath ceilings that told us how big we are allowed to be. We have looked up at painted heavens and thought they were out of reach. But the real heaven may not be above us at all. It may be buried below, waiting for eyes brave enough to see and hearts humble enough to listen. When the door opens, we will not find proof of faith or denial of it. We will find continuity, the missing chapter between myth and man. The bones of the elders will show us that creation was never about hierarchy, but about inheritance. That what we call divine might have once walked beside us, teaching through example, not command. The question is not if the door will open, but if we will be ready when it does. Because truth does not shrink to fit us. We must grow to meet it. The Vatican has spent centuries guarding what it cannot destroy. Perhaps not out of malice, but out of mercy. Maybe they knew that knowledge without wisdom becomes a weapon. Maybe they were waiting for a time when humanity would be mature enough to face its reflection in the bones of giants. That time might be now. The world has never been more connected, yet never more divided. We have the power to uncover the past, but not always the courage to understand it. The real vault is not beneath the Vatican. It is within us. Each of us carries a door in the mind, a place where forgotten truths knock softly, asking to be remembered. We have been trained to look away, to say, it is myth, impossible, unmeasured. But when we finally listen, we will hear the echo of something ancient and kind, something that built worlds and trusted us to continue the work. The door is not stone, it is memory, and it will open not with keys, but with understanding. When it does, the bones will not diminish. They will stand as they always have, patient and waiting. And we, the small and the forgetful, will finally stand beside them, no longer afraid of their height, but grateful to be part of the same story.